They called it the Century of Reason, yet the decisions of kings were still made under candlelight. France, 1745 to 1764. The reign of Louis XV. The long corridors of Versailles. The empire stretched across oceans, from Quebec's frost to the sugar wharves of Saint-Domingue. Into this court stepped Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, newly created Marquise de Pompadour, the official royal mistress. The stakes were dynastic heirs and diplomatic revolutions, church quarrels and colonial wars, the very architecture of rule. Some say a single favorite turned the tide of a great kingdom. Others say she merely reflected its fault lines, desire and duty braided like silk. What survives are letters, ledgers, portraits, and the hush of an antechamber where a bell at dawn always rang on time. The palace woke like a ritual. A bell at dawn. The measured scrape of chairs in the antechamber. Velvet shoes on waxed parquet. At Versailles, the day began with the king's lever. A ceremony of dressing that was also governance. A sovereign's sleeve buttoned as petitions were folded. Sunlight threaded the heavy brocade curtains and fell across a silver bowl where water glimmered, reflecting the face of the most Christian king, Louis XV. The corridors beyond were already alive with calculated footsteps. Ministers, bishops, officers, and the hushed industry of attendants moving as if time itself had a cue. In that choreography, a woman learned the tempo. Jeanne Antoinette, daughter of a financier's clerk, had been educated for conversation the way princes were trained for war. In 1745, the year of enchanted masquerades and a masked hunt at Versailles, she was received into the king's favor and raised to the nobility as the Marquise de Pompadour. In public, she perfected the art of appearing as if she did not speak when she had shaped the thought. Her fan hid a smile, her ring, a modest oval seal interlacing initials, touched sealed letters that crossed Europe. Her world was a theater of doors. The king's public rooms, the hall of mirrors, the grand apartments, were stages. His private apartments, the petite's apartments, were the wings where the whispered cues were given. There a letter was opened by candle flame, an idea laid like a silk scarf across a chair. Diplomacy with Austria, the protection of a thinker who had angered a bishop, a manufactory of porcelain that would bear the name of Sèvres, and at the edge of their intimacy stood the fact of the Dauphin, the prince of moral gravity, whose circle mistrusted the favorite, and the deeper force of church law and public expectation. The dynasty's future was not only a cradle, it was a treaty, a map, a ledger entry. Before her, there had been a vow. In 1744, the king had nearly died at Metz and made a pious promise to renounce his mistress. He returned to Versailles alive, chastened, and then the vow met the veil of human need. The veil did not lie. It filtered the light. He found in Jeanne Antoinette not only a companion, but an answer to the loneliness that follows command. She became a mirror in which he was not only king, but man. In that mirror, the cost of tenderness met the price of an empire, and neither gave way. Her insignia traveled even where she could not. A small enamel portrait in a locket hung on a ribbon, a book with a pressed blossom from Compiègne, a calling card scented faintly with orange blossom and something darker. Her seal softened and cooled on letters to ministers, to the Austrian ambassador Count Kaunitz, to poets and porcelain makers alike. The letters were never crude orders. They were persuasion in the old style, a shared memory of a hunting day, then a sentence about the utility of alliance, then a final line about the opera. Duty wore perfume, and the perfume was conviction. Court watched. Not just the dukes and duchesses who moved like chess pieces in gowns, but the men and women whose names do not enter the registers. A valet with a linen cloth, a woman who lit the lamps, a clerk in the Secrétaire du Roi who knew how many letters left the private desk before the sun reached the marigold border in the orangerie. They saw ritual turn into rule. They watched a ring flash as a hand drew curtains closed. They heard a key enter a lock. And almost no one knew what passed between a king and his mistress when silence settled and the last bell of morning ceased to toll. The specter at the edge of this was not jealousy. It was history. Wars already brewed on distant horizons. Habsburg and Hohenzollern ranged against each other. Britain's ships patrolled where French fur traders moved along northern rivers. France's old alliance with Prussia, strained as diplomats, Kaunitz above all, proposed a reweaving of the map. Within the kingdom, the parliaments contested royal edicts, Jansenist sermons questioned conscience, and the Society of Jesus faced scrutiny. A favorite could be a mediator or a scapegoat. The fan hid a smile, yes, but it also shaded the eyes of a woman who knew that even roses are cultivated by pruning. Whispers in palaces are made of very small things. A carriage turned early from one gate to another. A note delivered 1 hour past midnight with a seal that impressed too shallowly, as if the ring had been warmed and pressed in haste. A glove left on a windowsill of the Queen's staircase, pale kid leather imprinted faintly with a crest. A clerk in the outer office, duty-bound to log correspondence by time and place, noted in his small hand, petit billet, no origin, his hand, and dared not ask. Jeanne Antoinette learned to be seen without being looked at. She arranged concerts in the Royal Opera, invited scholars to read from banned volumes in rooms where the lamps burned low, and the walls seemed closer than before. Each gesture had two faces, an evening of music for the king's ease, and a reminder that culture was a form of rule. She intervened, it is said, to soften a censor's hand on the Encyclopédie. She patronized Voltaire, whose wit had teeth. Was she a friend to letters or a vanity in pearls? It depended on who described her, and why. Meanwhile, Europe's quiet was breaking at the seams. In Vienna, Kaunitz cultivated a plan to reverse France's old enmity with the Habsburgs. The young empress, Maria Theresa, wrote and received letters like arrows in velvet quivers. Paris salons hummed with the idea, daring and offensive to some, that centuries-old hatred could be revised for present advantage. At court, the man whose approval mattered rarely wrote more than a few words. Louis XV listened in the glow of a desk lamp, his fingers on the letter seal while others argued. Here, a mistress could be more than adornment. She was the kind of friend who could narrate a fear without naming it. The anomalies multiplied. An opera delayed by the sudden illness of a second violin. A minister's coach returning with curtains drawn at noon. A chaplain crossing the courtyard with unusual haste after a private audience. It was not clear whether such movements signaled rivalry or romance. The king had withdrawn somewhat from his queen, Marie Leschinska, whose dignity endured in cerulean silk and quiet prayer. Court eyes turned elsewhere, to the woman whose apartments became a hinge between domestic life and statecraft. Whisperers said she had a separate key to ministerial thought, that behind a mirror in her salon lay a cupboard where papers were kept. Others said that was nonsense. The mirror showed only her reflection, and for some that was provocation enough. A single note could tilt a room. One evening, as lamps were drawn and the event of the day, the comédie had ended, a folded slip passed from an usher's hand to a page, from a page to a valet, and then to the inner cabinet. The king read and did not move. He handed it to Jeanne Antoinette. Her fan did not flutter. The note reported a rumor from the borderlands. British ships gathering. Prussian couriers on the road. A German prince speaking sharply of French weakness. She looked at him not as a sovereign, but as a man buckled by responsibilities that could not be divided. Their glances were not just affection. They were a kind of tether against a tide. Servants notice when doors remain closed longer than usual. That spring, the door from the king's bedchamber to the private office stayed shut while a minister waited with a ledger. The minister moved from one foot to the other, the storm gathering in the sky beyond the leaded glass. At last, the door opened. The king came out with an expression not easily read. Jeanne Antoinette remained within, a slip of paper in her hand. Was it a poet's couplet, or a hint from Vienna? A rumor preserved in diaries says it contained the words, La main et le cœur, the hand and the heart, written in a careful feminine script. That may be invention. But to believe it is to admit how much palace rumor clung to symbols. The biggest rumor was the smallest and most cruel. It was said that to retain favor, while piety cooled the king's ardor, she arranged for the parc aux cerfs, a secret garden of selected companions for the king. Some describe it as a private cruelty of privilege. Others say it was an invention of enemies. Whatever its truth, the power imbalance was real. And those women, some very young, stood at the edge of a world that used them. Jeanne Antoinette, if she managed any of it, did so in a landscape where refusing might mean losing the only influence by which she tried to steer a kingdom toward what she judged a lesser harm. If she did not, the rumor reveals something anyway, that a single woman would be blamed for appetites built into the architecture of kingship. The day the Austrian ambassador visited with a gift, porcelain of an extraordinary pale blue, its glaze like air, was the day the first fissures of the diplomatic revolution were felt underfoot. He bowed. She inclined her head. The king asked a question about hunting and laughed at a memory from Compiègne. Within that laughter, the ambassador slid a thought. The thought that ancient enemies could be harnessed as friends if old prides were polished to a shine. The fan closed with a click. The room shifted. In the margins, the clerk in the outer office logged a series of letters sent at unusual hours. He doodled a fish in the corner of one page, perhaps a private joke about her family name, Poisson, and crossed it out when a footstep sounded. He could not know that a packet misfiled that week would be retrieved years later, and that in its fold, where the wax had left a faint crescent, lay a sentence that would be read like a key for debates long after the candles were snuffed. The air of 1756 felt heavy, as though Europe itself held its breath. In Vienna, parleys ripened into promises. In Versailles, the rooms felt smaller while the maps grew larger. The King's Council debated with measured tones, but the hush between each sentence was louder. War was a word that moved like a footman, always present, seldom acknowledged aloud. In the private office, a desk stood under a gilded clock. Beside it lay the signet, an oval seal, its interlaced letters polished by use. It is said that the night the treaty with Austria was sealed, the opera's last notes still trembled in the air. The Queen retired early. Ministers hovered like planets around a sun that seemed to dim. Jeanne Antoinette sat not beside the king, but slightly behind, where her voice could find his ear without announcing itself to the room. She spoke of balance more than of friendship, of the arithmetic of enemies. Maria Theresa's envoy, Kaunitz, wrote of a new order. She translated it into the grammar of a court where alliances had faces. Old courtiers recoiled. Austrians had been the hereditary foe, and not even Louis could forget that the wars of sons had been warmed by that hatred. He looked into the mirror, not to check his wig, but as if the glass might tell him something he could not tell himself. Duty in that moment felt like an ache in the ribs. He took the seal. He hesitated. There was a misting on the glass as fog crept in from the gardens. The candle flame guttered and steadied. He pressed the ring down on the red wax. The shape rose, precise, irrevocable. A single mistake threaded the moment, like a sand grain in silk. A clerk, young and careful, copied one line of the agreement onto a summary sheet for the minister's wallet. He was interrupted. An attendant required his presence for sorting the private correspondence. He folded the sheet and slid it into a file to be retrieved at dawn. But from fatigue or from fear, he placed it in the wrong file, one labeled for the porcelain manufactory at Sèvres. The error slept in a drawer while the world woke to consequence. Not 2 months later, a different night offered a different seal, the seal of danger pressed cold. In January 1757, a man forced his way near the king in Paris, and an edge glanced. The wound was more fright than fatal, but it broke a spell. Bells tolled. Prayers rose. The word attempt traveled like frost behind glass. Damiens, his name carried on paper like soot, was seized. It was a scene the city would never forget, but here we will choose silence over spectacle. Let it stand. that the wound healed and the scar remained on the court's mind more than the king's flesh. This attempt drew lines with new sharpness. Suspicion fell on factions. The Jansenist quarrels, the Parlement's assertions of conscience, the favorite's influence, all were tossed into the fire of blame. Jeanne Antoinette did not attend the interrogations. She did not instruct. She could not have. Yet the air around her cooled by a degree anyone could feel. She walked from the king's rooms to her own under the gaze of courtiers who held their mouths too still. That spring, the war that had glimmered on maps burst into movement. Armies marched to Germany's open fields. In the west, ships cut paths toward Canada's forests and India's monsoon shores. At Rossbach in November 1757, Prussia under Frederick struck like a wolf, and the French were scattered. Reports arrived bound with cord, pages spattered with rain and the mud of roads. The king received them with a face trained to betray as little as the marble busts on the console. Jeanne Antoinette read them in a quieter room, a hand to her forehead as if feeling for fever. The losses were not only on fields. In salons, words turned. The cry à la Pompadour became an accusation. She became the symbol it was convenient to blame. She had urged this alliance. She had tempted a pious king with theater while soldiers died in sleet. Or so adversaries said, their lips pressed thin. She answered rarely. But when she did, it was to insist that peace would cost more without honor than with constraint, that a reordering had been inevitable, that a mistress could not steer a nation alone, and that any woman who took counsel from her heart was already accused before she spoke. In an antechamber between state and sleep, a conversation took place that no one recorded and yet everyone imagined. The Dauphin, earnest, disapproving, asked his father to consider the counsel of confessors rather than that of a woman. The king turned slowly in his chair and looked at the candle flame. He spoke softly. Duty is not only a prayer. It is the endurance to remain where you are needed. His hand touched the table, not hers. He rarely reached for grand words and declined dramatics. Still, Jeanne Antoinette felt the weight of what she had chosen when she chose him. The cost was not in jewels or palaces, but in being named the author of every misfortune. The hidden misfiled summary came to light by accident in 1760, retrieved by a secretary who opened the Sèvres file looking for a contract with a glazier. Between invoices for pale blue vases and a pattern for a teacup lay a single folded sheet with ink, faded by 3 summers. It contained a line that linked the idea of alliance to language about prestige and personal trust, the vocabulary of court rather than of state. The find was shown to a counselor who smiled thinly and whispered that personal affection had always been the mother tongue of policy. It was a small thing, this sheet. Yet it would be copied in careful or contemptuous hands for decades as proof that a mistress had indeed pressed her fan gently against the scale. A winter evening drew them together more than any day of triumph. The king came to her rooms with mud on his boots from a hunt he could not enjoy. He sat beside the fire as a storm scuffed at the shutters. She poured tea from a Sèvres pot, whose glaze had been coaxed to the hue of a robiness egg. The silence was not empty. It was a place where 2 people bore the news together. A bell marked an hour. A key turned in a lock in the adjoining corridor, the sound slight and final. She set down the cup. He spoke of nothing for a long time, then of everything. The cost of sugar from islands where enslaved men and women labored the constant murmur of conscience in the parlements, the 2 long roads to 2 distant battles, and the fatigue that comes of being both symbol and steward. She listened. That, too, was governance. After the treaties, the ledgers. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris formalized a ledger written in ice and ash. New France ceded. Canada was no longer a French lake. In India, French fortunes narrowed to ports more symbolic than sovereign. In ministries, men in ink-stained sleeves added columns, scratched their heads over debt, and sent inventories to the crown. The king's signature, simple, practiced, traveled down papers that began to feel like eulogies for an age of effortless glory. In council chambers where the wood paneling had absorbed centuries of argument, voices rose and fell. Some placed the blame on ministers, others on the weight of enemies, others on the nature of fate. The favorite's name threaded each indictment as if fate wore a gown. She entered these rooms less often now. Illness, whispers, and the ordinary erosion of novelty kept her to her circle of music, porcelain, and the thin thread of influence she still possessed. When she did speak in those rooms, it was to remind them, gently, persistently, that a kingdom sustained itself by more than frontier lines. It needed the arts to cultivate pride, education to arm future ministers and officers, and clemency where cruelty would only produce martyrs. Proofs were strange things. A ledger entry for 120 vases could be argued as a sin of ornament in a time of war. But those vases, bearing the king's cipher, sold across Europe and brought sums back to the crown. A letter to Voltaire, thanking him for a tragedy, could be read as frivolity, or as a statement that France would be the beacon in a darkening continent. Rumors collided with these ledgers. The word bitter resins appeared in one diarist's slanted hand, a superstition that the favorite employed apothecary arts to keep the king docile. The physician's notes show instead a body and mind burdened by the one thing no apothecary could alter: time. A confrontation ripened in a parlor hung with green damask. A duke with a jaw too square for mercy cautioned the favorite about her vanity, a coded word for all that he despised in a woman who did not apologize for being present. She placed her fan on the side table and folded her hands. She did not defend her taste in porcelains or her patronage. She asked a question. Did he truly believe that a treaty was sealed because a woman wished it? Or that a war was lost because a woman preferred opera to drills? And if he did not believe that, if he knew that decisions were made by men gathered under the king's eye, why did his finger point her way? The duke colored slightly and asked to speak of other things. Elsewhere, in a corridor near a chapel, a priest who had heard confessions beyond counting paused. He had seen the king kneel, had seen the favorite pass with her head bowed and her rosary glinting. He knew that faith and failing do not tear each other apart so easily as debates demand. He kept his counsel. His silence was not complicity, nor was it condemnation. It was the old wisdom that souls are night gardens, where even the gardener cannot name every plant. The Dauphin's circle remained immune to her charms and argued for a narrowing of indulgence, fewer entertainments, fewer exceptions. Yet politics does not allow purity unalloyed. Men who preach simplicity loved their intricate lineages and estates. Men who condemned the favorite's expenditures enjoyed their own feasts. Court is a mirror maze, and every path reflects another's posture. The favorite's error, if error there was, lay not in taste, but in staying in a place where all virtues are turned to vices by proximity to power. A clerk's note surfaced, the misfiled summary now copied in several hands. It did not reveal a plot or a scheme, only phrasing that made it simple for enemies to argue that the heart had influenced the hand. This was enough. Pamphleteers took it up like a tune. In Paris, a shopkeeper unfolded a pamphlet for his customers and shook his head as if he had eaten bitter herbs. In salons, clever men sharpened epigrams that nicked as cleanly as knives without shedding blood. The favorite became an allegory. France, a stage, the war, a moral play. Stories are easier to hold than budgets. In the private life that public eyes prefer to mute, Jeanne Antoinette suffered. Her health strained. The coughed phlegm, the ache in the bones, the fatigue that fogged the head. The body does not judge, and it does not lie. She was not a witch or a schemer. She was a woman of intelligence and nerve, whose position asked her to remain poised while time pulled at the seams. The king visited her often, not as a lover in the old style, but as a friend who had learned to rely on the only person in his palace who never tried to bear himself aloft on his shoulders. She took his hand. There were no tears. There was the soft sound of one person saying to another, "I do not ask you for what you cannot give." The trial of hearts at court never ends. Verdicts are provisional. Appeals are held in private. For some, she would always be the villain of a story that absolved systems by blaming a single body. For others, she would remain a patroness whose taste elevated France and whose counsel, whatever its errors, was offered in good faith. The truth, as so often, lay between. Human desire entangled with duty, vanity shading into vision, fear into prudence, love into something that resembles policy only because both must be performed. In the spring of 1764, rain pressed at the windows of Versailles as if the sky had grown a memory. Jeanne Antoinette's body, worn by years of performance and by what physicians then named in the vaguest terms, a wasting cough, refused the calendar of court. She could not attend the concerts she had arranged, nor receive the men who still sought her signature on pleas. There was no formal exile for her. The exile was of a softer, crueler kind, the shrinking of a world to the measure of a bedchamber. The candlelight threw kind shadows. The fire banked down to a velvet glow. Around her, objects became companions. A ring placed in a porcelain dish, a fan folded and set atop a book, a letter with softened wax cradled like a bird. The king came, as he had come so often, by the small corridor where footfall could be muffled. He took the chair by the bed and spoke of ordinary things, as if ordinary things could contain grief better than any speech. A bell rang somewhere in the palace. He did not rise. At last she asked for a mirror, and then refused it. Vanity had been the arrow and the armor. She would leave it on the table. She asked instead for the key to a chest where she kept letters from years when a favor given had felt more like a beginning than a balance sheet. An attendant brought it, the key small and cool. The chest opened with a sound like a sigh. She touched the ribbons that bound the packets and left them bound. She had nothing to explain, and explanations are a poor last gift. On April 15, 1764, the favorite died. She was 42. The court rearranged itself as it always does, the way a pond surface stills after a stone. The king stood at a window and watched the funeral carriage leave. It is said, alleged in memoirs polished by regret, that rain began to fall, and he murmured, "The marquise will not have fine weather for her journey." Whether he spoke those words, or only thought them, the gesture of standing silently and looking into the rain is the image that survived. A quiet dismissal, then. Her portrait turned to the wall in some drawing rooms, her name spoken less plainly, her apartments repurposed for the next arrangement of ceremony. The dynasty, after all this, endured. Louis XV reigned until 1774. His grandson would lose a crown in 1792 to a new language of sovereignty. The thread between those dates is not a woman's fan alone. It is the braid of losses in a global war, the stubbornness of institutions, the ethics of belief, the hunger of cities, the careers of ministers, and the decisions of a king who found solace where he could. Yet she had shaped the court where those decisions were framed. She trained the king's ear to a different music, and in that music some measures were written in a minor key. The kingdom's fall would come, but it would be the prolonged end of a long score, not the drop of a single note. Still, in that candlelit exile, a chapter closed. The ring in the porcelain dish had impressed so many seals, and now it lay cold, its oval face catching only the wavering light. The fan, the letter, the key, all the small sovereigns of a woman's sphere, rested as if exhausted. What remains of a person in such a room are the things they used to translate will into world. It is a relief, perhaps, that even in palaces, endings are almost domestic. Decades later, workmen lifted a floorboard in a modest room at Versailles, slated for repairs, and found a ring wrapped in a strip of faded silk. The oval seal was scratched from years of use. The interlaced letters, J and A, or perhaps J and P, were still legible. The foreman handed it to an archivist who placed it on a velvet pad and began the calm work of marrying an object to a name. On a daybook from the 1750s, A note in a clerk's hand recorded the purchase of a small ring for correspondence. The clerk had drawn a fish and then erased it. The archivist smiled at the levity across time. In a drawer of the Sèvres archives, a locket surfaced, a miniature portrait, and a coil of chestnut hair sealed behind glass. Was it hers? The painter's style matched a date when she sat for such things. The provenance was blurry. A legend said it had been hidden by an attendant to keep it from being melted down in the Revolution. The record was stubbornly silent. The locket was catalogued as attributed to the Marquise. Legend and record negotiated, as they always do. A folded letter with softened wax turned up in a portfolio of miscellaneous papers, mislaid for reasons no one could recall. The wax bore a tired impression. The paper smelled faintly of old oranges and dust. The line that caused a stir in the 1760s, about trust, about the tie between affection and decision, read like a human truth more than like statecraft. Historians argued whether this proved influence or merely reflected it. It joins 1,000 other sentences that mean more as evidence of breath than as proof of guilt. In the margins of a ledger, a clerk's note finally explained the misfiled summary, interrupted for lamp wicks. A kingdom's narrative can turn on such domesticity. This does not absolve or accuse. It adds texture, reminding us that power and tenderness inhabit the same rooms. A portrait's varnish cracks. A name is erased from a register, and then written again in a different book. Between the legend of a royal mistress bringing down a kingdom and the record of choices made by many hands lies a woman who loved her country as she understood it, and a man who loved his comfort more than he loved change. The last image might be this: the wax seal cooling in the dark, its gleam softening, the sigil no longer warm to the touch. A letter travels into hands unsympathetic. Another rests forever in a drawer. The fan once opened with a whisper, now it sleeps. Yet in the quiet, the bell at dawn still rings in imagination, the symbol of a court that woke every day certain of its eternity, and went to sleep, not knowing how close the end had come.